Okay, good morning, well, good afternoon and good evening. I'm Alon Confino. I'm the director of the Institute for Holocaust, Genocide and Memory Studies at UMass. And it's my pleasure to have another meeting of Encounters, the program that the Institute has with the Avraham Arman Research Institute of Contemporary Jewry at the Hebrew University, directed by Amos Goldberg. This year, the topic of our series is aftermath. And today we are going to discuss with Yechiel Weizman his new book, Unsettled Heritage, Living Next to Poland's Material Jewish Traces After the Holocaust. Looks like this, very nicely designed and produced. With us, leading the discussion, will be Monika Rice. Monika is assistant professor and Robert Weiner and Ilan Peleg Scholar in Jewish Studies at Lafayette College. She's a former director of the Holocaust and Genocide Studies program at Graz College, a native of Poland. She earned her BA and MA in cultural anthropology from Adam Mickiewicz University in Poznan and a PhD in Judaic studies from Brandeis University. She works and teaches on the Holocaust, Jewish humor, Jewish studies, Jewish-Christian relations. Yechiel Weizman is a lecturer in the Department of Jewish History and Contemporary Jewry at Bar-Ilan University in Israel. He studied history, philosophy, and cultural studies at the Hebrew University in Jerusalem and completed his PhD in Haifa University in 2018. His research interests focus on the history and remembrance of the Holocaust in Eastern Europe, post-Second World War Jewish material culture and property restitution, Polish-Jewish relations, and Holocaust photography. Before I give the floor to Chilik and Monika, some housekeeping items. Our next encounter meeting will be on March 15th. We are going to discuss with Nicole Fox her new book about the aftermath of the genocide in Rwanda. Please send your questions. You see a tab Q&A at the bottom of your screen. That's the place to send your question. Do not send your question in the chat because they are not going to reach us. Also, this event is being recorded and it will be available on the website of the Institute at UMass Amherst in about a week time in our YouTube channel. Also, you will receive soon an invitation. If you are not already on our list, you can join our list or visit our website. So without further ado, Monika and Chilik, please.
Thank you very much, Alon, for inviting me to have this conversation about this really fascinating new book by Yechiel Weizman. Chilik, could you please first describe main claims of your work and maybe summarize its main points and what is novel about it? Why do we need this book?
Yes, so thank you all for attending. Thank you, Monika, Alon, and Amos. And yes, so I think that the core argument of my book is that the post-war discussion, Polish discussion on the future and status of the material Jewish traces, mainly Jewish cemeteries and synagogue, actually mediated a deeper and much more profound engagement with the memory of the extermination of the Jews. And I show, basically, I demonstrate this argument through examination of mainly local discussions of local officials, local organizations, and ordinary citizens who constantly dealt with the question, what to do with the Jewish cemetery that remained in our town, or what to do with the synagogue, the empty and deserted synagogue. And I'm focusing on small towns where usually Jews didn't remain after the war. And what I show is that this engagement was highly ambivalent, and it evoked a wide range of attitudes, conflicting attitudes sometimes, and practices and emotions, ranging from fear, contempt, reverence, to compassion. And this argument, I think, forks into sub-arguments, which I developed throughout the book, some of them more historical. For example, I analyzed how the dynamics of deciding what to do with Jewish spaces took place, and more, I would say, anthropological arguments about the meaning, the symbolic meaning of the presence of those sites for the Polish neighbors, who many of them saw and heard what had happened to their Jewish neighbors. So this is, in essence, the argument. And I think what is perhaps new, well, first, I think it's perhaps an attempt to tell basically what had happened and how it happened, and how the situation that we see today of the material Jewish culture in Poland, how it came to be. But more importantly, I think it shows, or this is what I claim, is that analyzing the very low scale and local discussions on the question of Jewish sites tell us something different, perhaps, about how Poles remembered and dealt with the memory of the Holocaust.
I will ask now the second question. So, Hilik, yeah, it's a fascinating book, really very nuanced and full of complexities and ambivalences, and describing ambivalences. And one is that is some kind of a dialogue, or I don't know how to put it, very tense, very interesting, full of conflicting interests and tensions between the political center in Warsaw and the municipality in the peripheries, where those small towns had to deal actually in a material way with the remnants. So can you tell us a little bit about these tensions between the political center in Warsaw, which has its own ideas and interests and pressures at that time, immediately in the first years after the war, and those who are in those peripheral towns that actually have to deal with the remnants, with the grounds, with the problems of the population, with the memories, very local memories. So how this tension is described, is played out in this historical drama, according to your book?
Yes, thank you for the question, Amos. And I should mention that Amos was the supervisor of my PhD dissertation, which was one of the supervisors, which is the basis of this book. So yes, so I think, yes, in a way, the center periphery tension is the key tension of this book, and it took many forms throughout the communist years, and it was perhaps strongest in the first early years. So what we see right after the war, that there is a very a strong effort and collective effort, it seems, by the local authorities to try to repurpose and to take over the remaining Jewish sites in a way to determine facts on the ground. But immediately after the war, it seems that the central regime, which at this time is still relatively attentive to Jewish concerns, to Jewish complaints, is trying in a way to hold the local authorities from erasing and repurposing Jewish sites. So it is very interesting that we can read discussions of state officials who are demanding local officials to put an end to the profanation, and they use the term profanation and desecration of Jewish sites. And it is perhaps part of a larger policy in the first post-war years, in a way to show good faith and to show the world some sort of an attempt to accommodate the Jewish survivors. After the first post-war, it seems that the gap between the center and the periphery narrows, but still it remains until the end of the communist year, the basing and the founding tension concerning the status of Jewish site. But perhaps the more interesting facet of this tension concerns the question of ownership, the question who owns the Jewish communal property. And while the regime, it seems that is trying, at least declaratively, to protect Jewish sites from complete destruction in the first years, it also seems that the state officials are very strict on the question of ownership, and they clarify over and over again the Jews has no ownership, no possession of their ritual places. But still, what is fascinating, I think, that at the local level, many local officials still believe that and treat the Jewish survivors as owners of their ritual sites, although the law says something else. And we see over and over attempts of the central regime to root out the perception that Jews are still owners or possessors of their communal property. But it seems that for many years after the war, local officials still try to negotiate the question of ownership with a Jewish representative. And I analyze this peculiar phenomenon, what I see as some sort of unease or embarrassment that existed at the local level, especially in the small towns, that prevented these officials to assimilate the notion that Jews are no longer owners of their religious sites. And I think it tells us something about the difficulty to really assimilate the demographical and the cultural outcomes of the war. And in a way, for several years after the war, Polish officials continue to imagine, I would say, the ghosts of the Jews, while according to the law, these sites actually belong to them.
Yeah, this interplay, if I may jump in here, between the central and peripheral authorities is a fascinating story, and the evolution of it is also a fascinating story that talks, really speaks to political and social history of Polish society. I was also curious about the interplay that is very prominent in your book throughout your chapters between the local authorities' official statements, documentations, petitions, correspondence you just mentioned, and the actual societal feelings, moods, impressions, and desires concerning those Jewish material sites or remnants of those sites. Maybe I have several questions really referring to that, and maybe you would be willing to give us a few examples. The one that seems to me most telling, and I'm curious how you would interpret how representative those official statements are in a situation when they tell one story of a certain procedure going on, certain desires of the local authorities to do something with the cemetery of the remnants of the synagogue. And yet there are also personal direct encounters between some remnants, representatives of Jewish community who are still there, and those officials, and they take place on much more confrontational character, sometimes even violent. Which activity, which evidence, the archival official or those meetings are more representative, you think, of what was actually happening in Polish society as far as their relationship to those remnants of Jewish sites?
Yes, it's a very good question. I think that when reading documents written under communism by officials dealing with a very sensitive issue, such as the Jewish issue, I needed to develop some sort of roadmap on how to read it, because it's very hard to detect and to disclose what is actually being said. So in many ways, when I was able to find descriptions of actual encounters in the periphery between those local officials and visiting Jews and Jewish representatives, I was able in a way to animate this very formal discussion and in a way to disclose, I would say, the emotional layer and the symbolic layer that is, I think, invested in this allegedly very bureaucratical language. So you can read very interesting protocols compiled by Jewish representatives or by the officials themselves, which actually tell a very intimate story, intimate in the sense of encounters between people from the same town that takes place in the Jewish sites. And these very interesting social encounter also helped me, I think, to decipher the silences of the documents, and also to read between the lines and to try to understand how certain terms and code words that the officials are using to allegedly discuss a bureaucratical municipal problem, I think in a way veil a very difficult and an uneasy subject with which they had to deal. So, for example, we can, read encounters of description of encounters in a synagogue between local officials and a Jewish woman who is coming to prevent the closing down of the synagogue, and they accuse each other and shout at each other, and it really developed into this very emotional confrontation that you cannot find usually when you read the documents. But it really helps to give, I would say, a clearer image of what was actually taking place surrounding these very small worship places and ritual sites.
I might add also that you really give voice to the absolute remnants, minute groups of remaining Jews in Poland, who were obviously, it was with each decade they were decreasing, and yet their persistence in fighting for those sites, for the proper respect towards those sites, and even in the most the years that were most violent towards the Jews, during anti-Semitic campaign, anti-Zionist campaign, 68, even during those times, those Jewish survivors still have real determination to put out towards the authorities their identity as the primary reason of why they're fighting for them, and are really unabashed about, they cannot be kind of silenced in this, under this whole communist ideology. They're still unabashed and fighting for the respect of those, for those ruins. And those confrontations also testified. So this was very interesting to see those really very few but very significant encounters that testify to the Jewish, in some ways, to the Jewish survivors' assertiveness, even while their numbers are diminishing and while they're still being harassed, they still stood up for the memory, basically, of their dead and the memory of their heritage. So that was also a very important part, I think, of the many layers you present in your book. Would you mind then, you obviously describe an evolution of both official and societal relationship to those Jewish material sites. Would you give just a general outline of those phases? And then I want to ask you about the relationship of your criteria or categorization towards a very famous book by Michael Steinlauf, Bondage to the Dead, where he also described more from the societal point of view, less official, but also societal point of view of how the Polish memory of the Holocaust developed. We can talk about it more, but if you wouldn't mind just giving an outline of your chronology.
Yes, so I structured the book into three main periods, which are not hermetic, and the boundaries between them keep changing, and they are very elusive, but there is, the first post-war period, which is from the first moments after the war in the summer of 45, until the early 50s, until the beginning of the Stalinist rule, it really changes the political discourse. And we can see that during this first post-war year, there is a lot of ambiguity and uncertainty, both at the local level, but also at the state level. And it's still not exactly obvious to officials what to do with these places and how to treat them. And it seems that also, as long as there are still survivors around, they are in a way able to influence the discussions and the perception of these places. But we see that into the 50s, during the Stalinist rule, and also later after the Polish Revolution in 56, and the adoption of a more communist national rule, we see that the discourse is changing. So basically, the second period which which I show is basically from the early 50s until the end of the 60s, until the anti-Zionist campaign. And this is a period in which it seemed local officials became much more confident to decide on their own the future and fate of their abandoned cemeteries or collapsing synagogues. And this is the period, especially towards the mid-end of the 50s, which we see a huge wave of demolition, also desecration and vandalizing of religious sites. And it has to do also with the rise of nationalist tendencies among both the local and state officials. And then right after 68, in the beginning of the 70s until the end of communist rule in 89, this is the period which I termed which is the third post-war period, in which there seems to be some sort of interesting disillusionment among the public from the historical and cultural policy of the regime. And it seems that there are more and more options to rediscover the lost Jewish traces. And this is the period in which attempts are being made to save and to salvage the remaining Jewish heritage. But also, this is also the time in which the discussion of the Holocaust and of Polish-Jewish relations during the Holocaust becomes central in Poland and the world. And it also leads to an interesting phenomenon in which the discussion on the physical traces is being associated with the very painful and difficult discussions on Polish responsibility and accountability during the Holocaust. Now, you mentioned the Michael Steinhoff, who is also creating some sort of this periodization, and he terms it memory repressed, memory recovered and erased. So I think Steinhoff focused on the key political and cultural players and events, and he was able to draw some sort of very general outline that makes sense when we look at the key developments. What I was trying to do is basically, in a way, to nuance this periodization and to show that when we go down to the highest resolution and we try really to focus on the local discussion, we see many different turns and avenues in which the discussion of what to do with the remaining Jewish space takes us. So in a way, there is no, I didn't see some sort of linear progression or very clear movement from repression to erasure to recovery. And I think it also tells us something about how collective memory works. It's never a simple story of repression and recovery. So memory functions in a very ambivalent and subtle way, which I was trying to show through the describing and analysis of the interaction with the actual traces, I think.
I will jump now, and I want to ask you, Hilik, about another tension in the book between material interests and, I would say, emotions that vary from all kinds of emotions and anthropological notions that you use. And I have here two questions for you. One is, can you explain this tension? I mean, do they fight? Do both sides fight for materiality or for memory, for emotions, maybe anti-Semitism, maybe or other? You used here already the notion, the concept of ghosts that haunts everybody. So what is the interplay between those two moments in history, and how do you reconcile them? The second part of how can historians talk about ghosts? They are very meaningful and significant in your book. How can you use this notion, and how in this specific, what do you actually mean in this specific in this concrete historical scene? So those are two parts to the same question.
Yes. So I think Jewish sites, on the one hand, were properties. Yes, they were property, and there was discussion what to do with them. That took place in very practical terms. They were also a municipal problem and a municipal question. But at the same time, those traces, and this is what I'm trying to show, were also reminders and remainders of the Jews and of their fate. And we can see a constant interplay between these two layers, I would say, this practical material layer, but also the more symbolic layer. And I think it also, in a way, I was trying to develop this twofold interpretation method that, in a way, treat these places and treat the discussion also in practical terms, because it was an economic question. But also, all the time, there was this question of what to do with these places. And the question what to do was a very deep question that, and we see all the time that it was never a simple undertaking. It was never neutral. So when you examine, for example, how other non-Catholic sites were treated and negotiated, like German traces or Orthodox traces, we can see that the discussions were held in a much more bureaucratic manner. But when you examine the language that was used during the discussion on the future of Jewish sites, you can see so many peculiarities and ambivalencies that, in a way, I think the only way to explain it is by uncovering, using a lot of discourse analysis and trying to read documents in a certain anthropological way, using also ethnographic materials that shows us that yes, this was always the tension. It is on the one hand, a property that has a value, but on the other hand, what basically makes it difficult to discuss these places as other properties or spaces is precisely their mnemonic charge. Yes, the way in which they incarnate memories, very direct memories of what had happened, not to the Jews in general, but to the local Jews who used to pray in this particular synagogue, or used to, or are buried, or their relatives are buried in this particular cemetery. And this very intimate mnemonic charge, in a way, animated or changed or turned the alleged bureaucratical engagement into something very different than any other question. And it takes me to the other part of your question, Yes, I discuss ghosts. Now, I'm trying to be very careful when talking about the Jewish ghosts, and I'm not using ghost as a metaphor. I'm trying to avoid using this very general metaphors. But when I talk about ghosts, I talk about real ghosts. I mean, there are many in many places. There were a lot of ghost stories, local legends, and stories about the actual ghosts that people see or talk about, who dwell in the Jewish cemeteries, or the ghost of the rabbi, who lives inside the synagogue, or stories about demons, about divine punishments. Some of these legends I myself heard while conducting interviews, and some I actually found traces in documents, yes. And these stories, these local beliefs, in a way testify on the very charged perception of these places and the way that the memory of the Jews lives on, and in a way is being attached to these places. And very often there are some ghost stories which are connected to what is perceived among people as some sort of local sin, the sin of using the cemetery for other purpose. And this is why, for example, certain people were punished. So this is where I'm trying to analyze ghost stories as a real phenomenon, some sort of a realm of experience of living next to this very unsettling material memories. And of course, today, in recent years, it became very common and fashionable to talk about the ghost of the Jews who are coming back to Poland in a more metaphorical way. And in a way, this discussion is also very problematic. And I try in the book also to analyze it critically, because of course, when we discuss Jews and the absent Jews as ghosts, as some sort of specters, it also has a political and ethical meaning. And in a way, I'm trying to be very careful when entering this very fuzzy field by sticking to, well, not to facts, because personally I don't believe in ghosts, but I'm trying to really to understand the way that those people gave sense or interpreted their own daily experiences.
Mm-hmm. And I will come in here because the anthropological interpretations are very powerful and very convincing, and to some degree unique in the literature on Polish-Jewish relations. I mean, Joanna Tokarska-Bakir, obviously, I know you refer to her a lot. She does this masterfully, but she's one of the few people who do that. So it's wonderful analysis. So drawing on that, I'm curious in the societal evolution from kind of almost extreme kinds of discourses. When you gave us an outline of your phases, you mentioned right at the end of the 60s, this comes to really a kind of apogee of exclusion, of treating the Jewish heritage as a nuisance that has to be removed. And another layer of interpretation comes over it, which is the treatment of those sites as polluting the Polish landscape in a metaphorical way and in a very basic pragmatic sense of being the kind of eyesore in those little towns where the administrators try to conduct some kind of modernization and urbanization of those little towns towards kind of better aesthetics. You call this a kind of aesthetic regime, which is very interesting. So you describe how within a few years, in the petitions of those local administrators, they are asking for the removal of polluting sites. And within a few years, then they, not the same people necessarily, but people in their positions switch and suddenly rediscover that those same sites, those old decrepit crumbling synagogues are suddenly world-class monuments that could bring rejuvenation to towns. I'm curious should we look at it as a sort of almost cynical, pragmatic switch with also kind of early wild capitalism that was coming at the end of the 80s and obviously the transition from communism in Poland? Or is there some societal change that would account for it? How do you interpret this really most drastic change in attitudes to those remnants?
Yes, so indeed there is a very swift discursive change, and we can see it happening right after the peak of the anti-Zionist event in the end of the 60s, and suddenly we see a different language. So I think that this rather swift change is in a way indicative of the way that, first of all, the way that the regime was very quick to recognize what had happened, and was very quick to recognize that now there is a worldwide criticism turned against Poland. And it, in a way, it led them to think how to, and this was indeed a very cynical and politically calculated move, how to rehabilitate their image after the world has witnessed yet again sites of Jews being forced to emigrate. So it led them to make this connection that by, in a way, supporting or preserving a Jewish site, it might lead to some sort of change or rehabilitation of their reputation. But what is perhaps more interesting, that it is the process that takes place at the grassroots level, because we see also in other aspects of social life in Poland, not that has other implication, that immediately after 68, there is a strong sense of disillusionment and disenchantment among large segment of the society from the belief that there is a way somehow to cure the communist system. And there is this strong movement from down below that realizes that now is the time to try to fight and to oppose and to try to envision an alternative cultural and historical story to the current communist nationalistic one. And for many parts of the Polish society, it seems that as part of this, I would say, oppositional atmosphere, trying to imagine a new future, it seemed that rediscovering the Jewish world, especially the material Jewish traces, trying to salvage them and trying through them to commemorate the memory of the Jews, is in a way an attempt to envision or to imagine this other alternative vision that allegedly, and of course it's a very nostalgic endeavor, but in a way it brings back or reevokes the multicultural history of Poland, the real Polish identity, as opposed to the imposed monoethnic Polish communist identity. And I think this is perhaps, and perhaps at this moment of really extreme violence, so very soon after, both the regime understand its implication, and also among growing circles in the society, this peak of violence, in a way, kicks off, in a way, a new phase of dealing with Polish heritage and culture that, in a way, puts the Jewish story, I would say, in its center.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Fascinating. I really appreciate that explanation. One of many contributions, I think, in your multi-layered analysis is that you bring comparative analysis with the treatment of Polish authorities and societies of other heritage sites, of other ethnic and religious groups, Germans, Orthodox Greek, also Orthodox Christians, and so on. And that is a very valuable comparison that I think should put in the context the specificity of treatment, the Jewish material remnants. So one thing that I was curious whether you think it had an effect on the Polish attitudes to Jewish sites was the fact that, according to Jewish law, cemeteries cannot be repurposed for any other activity if they are inactive, right? In Catholic tradition, they can be repurposed according to certain very specific ramifications. But this was probably the mindset behind some administrators asking for the change of the destination of the site after from the inactive cemetery. Do you think that conviction, that kind of tradition from the Catholic law, canon law, would influence their treatment of the Jewish cemeteries, and would that in some way modify or affect your interpretation of the societal attitudes towards those sites?
This is a very interesting question. Actually, the notion of the eternal sanctity of Jewish cemeteries as opposed to Christian cemeteries it's a subject that actually came up in the discussion. It was raised by Jewish representatives that try to explain why it's not allowed to repurpose a cemetery under any circumstance. And it led to very interesting discussions between state and local officials, Polish officials, really ontological discussion of what constitutes a cemetery, because local officials are trying to argue, well, there is nothing here, there are no headstone, no matzevot. And then state officials actually said yes, but it doesn't matter, because according to the Jewish law, as long as people are buried there, even if it's a completely empty space, it's still a cemetery. Now, it was as if those officials were conducting some sort of interesting halachic discussion on the question, what constitutes a Jewish space? Now, but eventually, I think that what in a way charged the status of Jewish spaces, particularly Jewish cemeteries, is not necessarily their sanctity according to Judaism, but their mnemonic charge. I mean, it was always a sensitive question to discuss whether to destroy, for example, a Jewish cemetery or not. And it was a sensitive question, I think, because of the meaning, of the symbolic meaning that these places acquired in the aftermath of the Holocaust. While at the same time, when discussing what to do with a German cemetery, it was much less sensitive question. Usually requests to demolish cemeteries of Germans, especially in the west of the country, were approved very quickly. Now, but when you read petitions to approve destruction of Jewish cemeteries, you can see that these discussions, even if they ended up in approval, they are very sick, and they are very complicated and raise many questions of objection. And I think it's probably less because of their special religious status of cemeteries in Judaism, but mostly because of the meaning that these places acquired after the war and in light of the war, I would say.
Thank you, Hilik. I'd like us to move to the Q&A. We have some questions, and I'd like to begin with a question of Professor Asher Matathias. He mentions the case of Salonika in Greece, in which the inhabitants refused to consider Jewish property and actually paved over the Jewish quarter to build Aristotle University, which brings us also to a comparative, perhaps, perspective. In the 1940s, in Europe, in India and Pakistan, in Palestine and Israel, and in many other places, there were cases of groups of people that were either expelled or exterminated, and the issue of what to do with their material being in the decades thereafter. In what way this literature influenced you, and in what way do you think your study can be a model for such an investigation in other cases?
Yes, throughout the book, I sometimes use comparison from other cases in order to place the specific case study of the Polish Jewish case in a larger, almost universal context. Because what we see, especially in the 40s, after large-scale conflict, that the question what to do with religious property, communal property, is always a very tense and charged question. So in many ways, you can recognize very similar patterns used by officials in order to justify very extreme language, usually, that is used in order to justify the demolition, the repurpose of minority sites, especially minorities which in a way implicate the majority society in very unsettling question. And in many cases, this language is a language of that uses notions of purity and impurity, of the dirt and danger. So I read it as some sort of anthropological discourse that in a way tries to hide or to remove the remaining traces as some sort of a symbolic operation of dealing or achieving the erasure or completing the erasure of memory of minorities. What I also found, which is interesting, for example, examining cases such as in Cyprus after the Turkish invasion in the 70s and the resettlements of the Turkish Turks into Greek Cyprus, we can see that the discussion what to do with, for example, Greek property, Greek cemeteries, was always not a neutral question. And it, in a way, we can see very interesting cases in which dealing and living next and negotiating the status of this other's heritage evoked a certain unease and embarrassment, and led to some difficulties in determining the actual status of these places. And we can also recognize some practices employed by local communities living next to traces of other minority in many different parts of the world that also, I think, testify for some unresolved issue of this that unresolved issue concerning the meaning of this place. So it's usually never just a story of complete erasure and forgetfulness. I think when you look especially into local discussion and local practices, you can see that these places, however redundant and remote and abandoned, still, I think, possess some very interesting identity that sometimes can be also disclosed when trying to understand the local perception and experience of these places.
The ghost stories that you mentioned, I mean, the real ghost stories, are fascinating. And I was wondering whether the ghost stories have a history. That is, do they appear more immediately after the war, then they recede, and then they come back again in the 80s? Or maybe there is a different history. And I'd like to link it to a somewhat related question. So what is the place of the category of generations in your narrative? In your narrative, there are three main periods: immediately after the war, then the 50s until the late 60s, and then the 70s and 80s. So how do generations fit into this? The generation that lived through the Holocaust, and then those, of course, that did not, etc. And whether the ghost stories or the narrative, the history of the ghost stories has something to do with this as well.
I think in a way, yes, the ghost stories has a history. They actually have even a pre-war history, which is very, very important. And I mention it because the notion of Jewish ghosts and Jewish demons is very rooted in Polish or Eastern European folklore. If we think about the Dibuk and other Jewish apparition, and actually in Polish Catholic culture, ghost has a very central place. Now, after the war, of course, these stories devolved into something much more threatening, and we can hear these stories right after the war. For example, in description of Jews who returned to their towns in 46, 47, and it seems that these ghost stories accompanied the upcoming post-war decades. At a certain point, I think in the 70s or the 80s, and maybe this is also has to do with the generational issue, the Jewish ghosts become less threatening and much more, I would say, friendly. So in a way, instead of an attempt to, I would say, to exorcise the ghost, there is some sort of cultural, real or metaphorical attempt to accommodate them. And I think that now the notion, the trope of Jewish ghosts became a very widespread notion that in a way loses its threatening and chilling nature. It also tells us something about how Jewish memory function and perceived today. And I think, yes, the general issue is also very important to understand the perception of Jewish spaces, because we see that in the first post-war years, during the time where when many of the local officials who dealt with this question, many of them basically, they remember what had happened. They were discussing the future of places that they knew from before the war. And I think it gave the discussion a whole different atmosphere and tone. While later we can see that the discussion that are held by the next generation of officials have a different tone. I mean, those are people who were born into a reality of Jewish absence, and it also, in a way, it doesn't erase the ambivalences and the complexities, but in a way, it takes to a more, I would say, violent or a resolute place. And then, of course, there is also the next generation who is basically trying to rehabilitate, to recover, and to retell the story of these places and these people.
Maybe, you know, maybe the ghost stories are threatening when the guilt is personal, and the ghost stories are less threatening. They are something of the past, when there is a new generation for whom the ghost is really a metaphor. Yeah. But it's just an idea. So we have two questions that brings in the Jews to this story. And I think this will be our last question, because we are very much conscious of another historic event that is to begin in 2 minutes with two other actors, non-Jewish, but still very important, Messi and Lewandowski. So Sidra de Koven Ezrahi and Lori Biller both bring in the Jews in the story. And Sidra tells a story in regard to her mother's town in Poland, where there was an acerbic exchange between herself and a second cousin, both descendants of the same great-grandfather. And the discussion was about ways of dealing with the headstones, the matzevot, that were used as a wall around the local Christian cemetery. Sidra have wanted to foster a conciliatory ritual between local residents and descendants of the Jewish inhabitants. And her cousins violently respond that if this would be the case, they would destroy the wall. So how did Jews react to these different phases? How did the Jewish descendants who return, perhaps in the 80s and after the fall of communism, more recently to Poland, have reacted to these changes?
So I think during the first, when Jews first visited Poland and went to their towns, it was in the 70s and 80s, in many ways, many of them complained to the authorities, and in a way, they generated first attempts to do something, and they raised the issue, okay, we have a problem here, and people are visiting and asking questions, and we need to do something. And indeed, many Jews were involved, became very much involved from the early stages in attempts to renovate or preserve Jewish sites, mainly American Jews, less so Israeli Jews. And I think we can detect perhaps today among Jews very two different tendencies. On the one hand, some very much cooperate with local Polish activists who are those are the ones who are basically doing much of the work and contributing money and cooperating. But on the other hand, and I could also feel it and sense it many cases, there is this strong suspicion of or disbelief that Poles are able or capable of preserving Jewish heritage. But I think in recent years it changes. So I think this suspicion and hostility really changes, and there are so many local initiatives and cooperations by NGOs and private organizations and church leaders and teachers trying to really rehabilitate and preserve Jewish sites in their own town. And by doing so, they, in a way, trying also to commemorate the story of the local Jews, which sometimes also leads to tensions, as we know from recent historical discoveries.
Hilik, thank you for this illuminating discussion, for a great book. Amos, Monika, if you have some things to say to close, please.
So I just want to say before we close that it was a real pleasure, and yes, as you said, it's a really real pleasure, especially when we see. You see how an idea evolves into a doctorate and then into a fascinating book, as Professor Marcus Zilber of Haifa and I supervised it in Haifa, in Marcus University in Haifa. So it was a real delight.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, thank you. I just want to add as well that it was a incredibly a multi-layered interpretation of what was happening in Poland throughout the end of even communism and beyond. And we also look forward and are curious and a little bit anxious of what will be happening with this heritage and with the Polish consciousness of it and memory concerning recent kind of renationalization discourse since 2015 with the new government, with the peace government. So it's a kind of a little bit of a story that I wonder how it ends in some way. But thank you for the book. It was amazing.
Yeah, thank you.
Hilik, are there plans to publish the book in Polish?
I don't know. I know that there are attempts to translate it, but I hope so.
Yeah.
We hope. Yeah. And thank you, Monika, thank you, Amos and Alon, for this fascinating discussion and great opportunity, and for all of the attendees. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Bye.
Goodbye.
Bye-bye.
Thank you.